You know what finally humbled me as a woodworker? Watching a man split a massive green oak log perfectly in half, using nothing but wooden wedges and a mallet. No chainsaw, no bandsaw, no guide. Just a deep understanding of how that tree grew and where the wood wanted to separate. I stood there thinking, I have been doing this for decades, and I could not do what this man just did with the simplest tools imaginable. That was my introduction to traditional Viking shipbuilding methods, and I have to tell you, it completely changed how I think about working with wood. Today, I am going to walk you through the techniques these Norse shipwrights used to build some of the most extraordinary wooden structures in human history, and show you why their methods still have so much to teach us. Plus, stick around to the end, because I will share a wedge-splitting technique I picked up that gives you remarkable control over how a log separates. Let me show you what I found. Viking shipbuilding is not some lost, mystical art. It is one of the most sophisticated and practical woodworking traditions ever developed, and the remarkable thing is how much of it translates directly to what we do in our shops today. Once you see how these shipwrights thought about wood, you start questioning a lot of the habits most of us picked up along the way. So, let me give you some context first because it matters. The Norse shipwrights who built longships between roughly the 8th and 11th centuries were not working in fancy workshops. They were building on shorelines, in forest clearings, sometimes in brutal cold, with hand tools that most modern woodworkers would consider primitive. But here is what I learned that changed my perspective. Those tools were not primitive at all. They were purpose-built and refined over generations to do exactly what was needed, nothing more and nothing less. The Viking longship is one of the great engineering achievements of the medieval world. These vessels crossed the open North Atlantic. They navigated shallow rivers. They survived storms that would tear apart most modern wooden boats. And they were built almost entirely from freshly felled oak, split and shaped by hand, assembled with iron rivets, and designed to flex with the sea rather than fight against it. The guiding principle behind all of it comes down to something deceptively simple: work with the wood, not against it. Every technique I'm about to show you flows from that single idea. These shipwrights understood that a tree has a structure, a grain direction, a natural tendency, and if you respect that structure instead of forcing the wood into submission with machines, you end up with something stronger, lighter, and more durable than anything you could produce by sawing boards out of a kiln-dried plank. That is not philosophy. That is engineering. And once I understood that, everything else made sense. The first technique that struck me was how these shipwrights read a log before they ever touched it with a tool. They would walk around a felled oak, studying the bark, the branching pattern, the way the trunk curved. They were looking for clues about the internal grain structure. Where did the tree lean? Where did the major limbs grow? Was there a twist in the trunk? Every one of those external features tells you something about what is happening inside. A branch on one side means tension, wood on the opposite side. A curve in the trunk means the grain follows that curve. Before the first wedge was ever set, they already had a map in their heads of how that log was going to behave. Most of us skip this entirely. We buy pre-milled lumber and never think about the tree it came from. But when I started paying attention to grain direction the way these shipwrights did, even on boards from the lumberyard, I started getting cleaner cuts, tighter joints, and fewer surprises. Now, let me show you the technique that stopped me in my tracks. Cleaving a full oak log with wooden wedges. The shipwrights would take a green oak log, sometimes 3 feet in diameter, and split it right down the center using wedges, carved from hardwood, usually beech or hornbeam. They would start by scoring a line across the end grain with an axe, following the radius of the log from bark to pith. Then, they would set the first wedge at one end and drive it with a wooden mallet, not a sledgehammer, a mallet. Then a second wedge a foot or so further along, then a third. As each wedge goes in, the split travels ahead of it, following the grain perfectly. The sound it makes is extraordinary, this deep, resonant crack that runs through the entire log. And when the two halves finally separate, the surface is not rough or torn. It is clean and follows the natural fiber of the wood with zero deviation. That split surface is actually stronger than a sawn surface because every single fiber is intact. When you saw through wood, you sever fibers. When you split it, you separate them along their natural boundaries. The shipwrights knew this, and it is the foundation of everything they built. Once a log was split into halves and then into wedge-shaped planks, the broadaxe came out. And this is where the real skill showed itself. A Viking-style broadaxe has a wide, flat blade on one side and a beveled edge on the other. It is designed to be swung along the surface of a plank, shaving off thin layers of wood with each stroke. The shipwright would stand on the plank, sighting down its length, and hew it to shape using nothing but his eye and the feel of the tool biting into the grain. No chalk lines, no templates, just experience and an understanding of what the finished plank needed to look like. The accuracy is astonishing. I watched a man hew a plank down to about 1 inch thick over a length of nearly 14 feet, and when I checked it afterward with a straight edge, the variation was less than 1/8 of an inch, with an axe, by eye. Now here is where it gets really clever. The hull planks on a Viking longship are not flat boards. They are curved, twisted, and tapered because they have to follow the complex compound curves of the hull shape. And the shipwrights shaped every single one of those planks by eye with a broadaxe and a side axe, working the green oak while it was still flexible enough to cooperate. They would rough out the general curve with the broadaxe, then refine the twist and taper with a smaller side axe, constantly checking the plank against the emerging hull shape. The plank might be 2 inches thick at the keel end and taper to 3/4 of an inch at the top edge, all while curving and twisting to follow the hull. No steam bending, no lamination, just reading the grain and shaping it while the wood still had enough moisture to hold the curve. When I tried this on a much smaller scale with a piece of green-white oak and a hatchet, I was amazed at how willing the wood was to take a shape, as long as I followed the grain instead of fighting it. By the way, if you are enjoying learning about these shipwright methods, I put together something I think you will really appreciate. It is called Secrets of the Shipyard, and it covers 16 chapters of Viking and naval carpentry techniques that most woodworkers have never seen. 150 pages of real hands-on knowledge. You can grab your copy by scanning the QR code on screen, or just use the first link in the description. All right, let us keep going. The clinker planking system is the technique most people associate with Viking ships, and for good reason. It is brilliant. In clinker construction, each plank overlaps the one below it by about 1¼ inches, like clapboard siding on a house but on a boat hull. The lower edge of each plank sits on top of the upper edge of the plank beneath it, creating a stepped profile from keel to gunwale. But this is not just about appearance. That overlap creates a structural ridge along the entire length of the hull. Every overlap is a stiffening element, and because the planks are fastened through the overlap, the entire hull becomes an integrated shell that distributes stress across the whole structure rather than concentrating it at any single point. Most modern boat construction uses carvel planking, where the planks sit edge to edge and the hull gets its strength from heavy internal framing. The clinker method is the opposite. The shell itself is the structure, and the internal framing is minimal and light. The result is a hull that weighs far less than a carvel-built hull of the same size, but is remarkably strong. The riveting is where the craftsmanship really shows. The shipwrights would drill through both overlapping planks using a T-shaped auger, then drive an iron rivet through the hole from the outside. On the inside, a small iron plate called a rove was placed over the rivet tip, and the tip was peened over to lock everything tight. The spacing was consistent, roughly 4 to 5 inches, between rivets along the overlap. But here is the detail that impressed me most. Before riveting, they would lay a thin cord of wool soaked in pine tar along the overlap seam. That tarred wool compressed under the rivet pressure and created a watertight seal that could last for decades. No caulking compound, no silicone, just wool and pine tar, squeezed between 2 oak planks and held by iron. I have seen reproductions of this technique where the seal was still holding after 20 years in the water. Now, the real genius of clinker construction is what it does to the hull as a whole. Because each plank overlaps and is riveted, but not rigidly locked, the entire hull has a slight amount of flex built into it. When a Viking longship hits a wave, the hull does not resist the force. It absorbs it. The planks shift against each other by tiny amounts, the overlaps flex, and the energy dissipates through the structure instead of concentrating at stress points. Sailors who have been on replica longships describe the hull as feeling alive, almost like it breathes with the sea. That flex is why these ships could survive North Atlantic crossings that would crack a rigid hull apart. And it is the same principle that Japanese timber framers use in earthquake zones. Controlled flex is not weakness. It is a design choice, and it is the reason these structures lasted. One technique I did not expect was how carefully the shipwrights selected their trees. They did not just go into the forest and cut the biggest oak they could find. They looked for trees that had grown in specific ways. A tree that grew on a hillside and leaned slightly would have a natural curve in its trunk, and that curve was perfect for the sweeping lines of a bow or stern plank. A tree that grew straight and tall in a dense forest would have tight, even grain ideal for long hull planks. A tree with a major branch at just the right angle could provide a natural knee, a curved structural brace, without any need to cut the grain. They were essentially harvesting pre-shaped components from the forest, and because the grain followed the shape naturally, every piece was stronger than anything they could have bent or laminated. The shipwrights also worked almost exclusively with green wood, and this was deliberate. Green oak is dramatically easier to split, shape, and bend than seasoned oak. The moisture in the fibers acts as a natural lubricant for splitting and makes the wood more cooperative under the axe. But more importantly, as the shaped planks dried in place on the hull, they hardened into their final form. The wood essentially cured while holding the shape the shipwright gave it. If you try to shape kiln-dried white oak with a broad axe, you are in for a very long day. Green oak practically invites the tool through. When a hull plank was not long enough to run the full length of the ship, the shipwrights would join two planks using a scarfed joint. They would taper the ends of both planks over a length of about 8 to 10 inches, creating a long, shallow wedge shape on each piece. The two tapered ends overlapped, and the joint was riveted just like the clinker overlaps. No glue. The long taper distributed the stress over a wide area, and the rivets held everything in alignment. What made these joints remarkable is that they were nearly invisible on the finished hull, and just as strong as the surrounding planking. The taper ratio was typically around 8:1, meaning for every inch of plank thickness, the scarf ran 8 inches long. That geometry is still used today in traditional wooden boat building. Here is something most people never consider. The finished surface of a Viking hull plank was not sanded. It was finished with an axe and sometimes a draw knife or scraper. And that surface was actually superior to a sanded surface for a boat hull. When you sand wood, you tear and fuzz the fibers at the surface. When you slice fibers cleanly with a sharp-edged tool, the surface is burnished and tight. Water beads on it rather than soaking in. The shipwrights knew that a tooled surface would resist water penetration better than an abraded one, and on a vessel that lives in the ocean, that difference in surface quality translates directly to durability. I have applied this idea to outdoor furniture projects, finishing the surfaces with a sharp hand plane instead of sandpaper, and the difference in how those pieces weather is noticeable. Let me share some patterns I have noticed over the years, things I used to do myself that the Viking tradition handles completely differently. The first pattern is relying on sawn lumber for everything. Most of us go to the lumberyard, buy boards that were sawn out of a log, and never think about what that process did to the grain. Sawing cuts across fibers at random angles, weakening the wood at every point where a fiber was severed. The Viking approach of riving, splitting along the grain, produces stock where every fiber runs the full length of the piece. The strength difference is dramatic. The second pattern is avoiding green wood. We have been taught that wood needs to be kiln dried before you work it, and for many applications that is true. But the shipwrights showed me that green wood is not a liability. It is a resource. When you need to shape curves, make splits, or hew surfaces, green wood cooperates in ways that dried wood simply cannot. The third pattern is over-engineering with rigid joints and heavy framing. Most of us build things to be as stiff and immovable as possible. The clinker hull teaches a different lesson. Sometimes a structure that can flex and move is stronger than one that is locked rigid. I have started applying this thinking to outdoor projects especially, where wood movement from seasonal changes is constant. The fourth pattern is reaching for sandpaper as the default finishing method. After seeing the surface quality that a sharp axe or plane produces, and understanding why that surface performs better in exposed conditions, I have cut my sanding way back. For any project that will live outdoors, a cleanly tooled surface outperforms a sanded one every time. The good news is, Once you see these patterns for what they are, you can start shifting your approach one project at a time. Now for that bonus tip I promised at the beginning. This is a wedge splitting technique I learned from watching a traditional shipwright control the split line on a green oak log, and I have never seen it taught anywhere else. When you are driving wedges to split a log, the split will naturally want to follow the path of least resistance, which sometimes means it drifts off to one side, especially if the grain is not perfectly straight. Here is how they controlled it. Instead of just adding more wedges along the top, they would drive a single shallow wedge into the side of the log on the thick side of the split, the side where the split was running away from center. That side wedge creates a counter-pressure that nudges the split back toward the center line. The key is to keep the side wedge shallow, no more than about 1 inch deep, just enough to redirect the tension. I have used this technique on white oak, red oak, and ash, and it works beautifully every time. It is the difference between getting 2 clean halves and getting 1 fat half and 1 thin one that is useless. A small thing, but it is the kind of knowledge that only comes from generations of people solving the same problem over and over. One more thing before I let you go. I spent a long time gathering the best traditional shipwright methods I have come across, and I put them all into a book called Secrets of the Shipyard. 16 chapters of techniques that most modern woodworkers have never seen, with hand-drawn illustrations and clear explanations you can actually follow in your shop. Scan the QR code on screen right now, or grab it from the first link in the description. I appreciate you watching, and if you want more of these deep dives, make sure to subscribe. I will see you in the next one.